This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 220 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about some actual steps we can take to deal with the big, complicated, problematic beast that has taken over our education system, otherwise known as standardized testing. When we talk about the problems in education, we often end up pointing fingers at standardized testing as a major culprit. And there's a good reason for that. Standardized testing has consumed an incredible amount of time, money, and energy that could have been spent on other things. It has changed the way many teachers teach, and not for the better. It has caused schools to be penalized in ways that only exacerbate their existing problems. It has created a huge amount of stress and anxiety, and so on and so on and so on. But when we do this finger pointing, we usually stop right there. We acknowledge that the testing is the problem, and then we sort of shrug and say, what are you going to do? The problem seems too big and bureaucratic to solve, so we just accept it and move on, and nothing really seems to change. This frustrating state of inertia has always bothered me, and I sensed that surely someone somewhere had to be tackling this problem with more creativity and determination than I was aware of. So I sent out a tweet to see what I could learn. The tweet said this: 2 questions about standardized testing. 1, are any states successfully moving to reduce the overall volume of their tests and/or lowering the stakes? And 2, are there any activist movements that are making headway toward reducing standardized testing? What can you tell me? So I sent this out on September 12th of 2023. Of all the responses I got, the one that grabbed me the most came from Jenn Binis, a researcher and fact checker who works in education. She knows a lot about education history in the U.S. and pays much closer attention to current educational policy than I do. I've been following her on Twitter for years, and I always admired how level-headed and well-informed she was on educational topics. So when she replied to my question with some hopeful leads, and then continued our conversation through DMs, I sensed that she might be the right person to offer some possible answers to the question of what do we do about standardized tests. So I asked her if she would write a post for Cult of Pedagogy. She agreed. And it is written and it is published today. And if you go to cultofpedagogy.com and click podcast and go to episode 220, you will find that full blog post where she has written out 5 really specific things that we can sort of do to address the problem of standardized testing. And it's got lots and lots of links that go out to all kinds of other resources. So today we're going to be talking about what those 5 things were and kind of summarizing them. I'll tell you right now, she does not offer any quick fixes, but what she does offer are a lot of different pathways for making standardized testing work for us and not against us. She offers some mindset shifts, some instructional changes, shifts in what we do with test scores once we get them, and some bigger structural changes that are happening in some states that can serve as a model for the rest of the country. Before we get started, I'd like to thank EduBadges for sponsoring this episode. Are you seeking a professional development experience that truly resonates with your teaching journey? Discover EduBadges, your destination for personalized, flexible learning. Choose from a library of over 270 badges aligned with the ISTE standards for educators. Whether you're looking to enhance classroom engagement, integrate technology, or sharpen those Tier 1 instructional skills, EduBadges covers it all. It's straightforward. Select badges that align with your goals, learn at your own pace, and celebrate your progress. Each badge you earn is not just a symbol of achievement, but a stepping stone toward practical classroom applications and improved student outcomes. And every badge you earn can be redeemed for valuable contact hours or even graduate credit. Visit edubadges.com today. That's EDGEUBADGES. And use the code CULT for $20 off a premium account. Join EduBadges now, where your passion for teaching meets the joy of learning. Support also comes from No Red Ink. Spring testing is right around the corner. This year, take the stress out of ELA test prep by using No Red Ink to help your students develop the foundational skills and strong writing habits they'll need to excel on test day and beyond. No Red Ink's comprehensive writing platform includes thousands of adaptive exercises, scaffolded writing activities, and pre-made assessments, all of which are aligned to specific state standards and tests. These activities incorporate highly relevant texts and interests that students select themselves, keeping students engaged as they master everything from word-level grammar to ideal paragraph structure. No Red Ink recently released a ton of new content designed specifically for learners in grades 3 through 5. So if you're an elementary teacher, now is the perfect time to give No Red Ink a try. Sign up for free at cultofpedagogy.com/noredink. One more thing. In my last episode, I offered 8 tech tools that I thought were interesting ones to check out, but I wanted to add one more. It's called We Do It for the Culture, a social emotional learning curriculum for grades 6 through 12 that's grounded in the elements of hip hop. The curriculum is designed to help educators recognize the importance of their students' diverse cultural narratives while leveraging their strengths to build on areas of growth. I haven't seen anything else like it, and I'm really impressed by how thorough and well organized the site is and how thoughtfully written the lessons are. If you teach an advisory class or just want to incorporate more SEL into whatever class you teach, this is definitely something to look into. You can find it at wedoit4theculture.com. wedoitfortheculture.com. Now, here is my conversation with Jenn Binis about standardized testing. Jenn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited for this conversation.
I'm excited too. I have to start off by saying that I have sort of known you lightly through Twitter for years and years, and you have always conducted yourself in a way that has been so admirable to me in terms of like just the restraint that you show while still managing to sort of push people's thinking respectfully. And so anyway, I'm just really excited that you're here.
That's very, very gracious of you to say. And the number of tweets that I've yelled at my cats or to my office or just like, grumbled into the air, but not sent is a very large number.
That's an important strategy for social media. Yell it to your cat first and then revise.
Exactly.
So the way that we got to this point was there was a conversation on Twitter happening about standardized tests as it happens all the time. And you said something that kind of grabbed my attention. So I thought, I think you'd be the perfect person to come on here and write a post for Cult of Pedagogy that really says, okay, let's have a real conversation about standardized tests that goes beyond the get rid of testing, that seems to happen. So before we get into it, because you have written a brilliant post that we are going to be publishing at the same time as this conversation, tell us, for the people who have not been following you on Twitter forever, who are you in education? What do you do? What is your role? And let's get to know you that way first.
So I will start with where I am now. I'm a freelance editor, fact checker, and researcher for education authors. So I work with those who write about education, either because they're in it or they're peripheral to it. And I honed my skills as a developmental editor after doing 20 years of professional development with teachers across the East Coast. I primarily worked in curriculum and assessment design, and the majority of my work is in New York State. And New York State, every state thinks they're special. New York State really is very, very different when it comes to all the other states. And we don't necessarily need to get into that, but it does play a role in standardized testing, and it does play a role in systems things. And the disadvantage we have is of New York City is the largest school district in the country. And so a lot of people think New York City is how New York State is how the country is. I did a lot of work with curriculum and assessment design with teachers, and did a lot of work around locally designed standardized testing, locally designed performance-based assessments. Just a lot of time thinking about how do we capture evidence of student learning and what does that look like?
Gotcha. Okay. And so what we are going to be talking about today, why don't you set us up? where are we right now in terms of standardized testing, and what is the approach that you and I have decided you're going to take in terms of how we're going to be advising people to start thinking about it?
I think what's helpful as we start any of these conversations, and one of the things we try to get across in the piece is the first step is to define what are we talking about when we use the phrase standardized tests.
Mhm.
Taken at its most largest, at its most encompassing definition, a standardized test is a test in which the testing conditions are the same for all test takers, same
Mhm.
directions, same prompts. There are accommodations for people with disabilities, a larger font, perhaps a screen reader, but the general assessment is the same, and all students are scored using the same measure. When we look at that definition, teachers give standardized tests all of the time. Final exams, midterms, chapter tests, weekly spelling
Mhm.
tests.
Mhm.
Technically, they're standardized tests,
Mhm.
but we know that's not what we mean when we say standardized tests. I think for the purpose of our conversation, we should pick up a box labeled SATs and politely put it to the side. And we're just going to ignore that box. I don't
Okay.
think there's necessarily any um, value in bringing the SAT conversation down into,
Mhm.
K-12 3-8 assessments. It's an
Okay.
entirely different conversation. But for the purpose of our conversation, we're talking about when people say standardized tests, they generally mean the large scale, usually multiple choice tests that were mandated beginning in 2001 as a result of No Child Left Behind. So
Mhm.
that's what we're talking about. And as I share in the piece, I had a conversation with a superintendent. Oh goodness, I don't even want to say a year and absolutely age myself here. But it was kind of funny because while we were talking, we were putting away chairs. And sometimes like the best conversations happen when you're doing something else, like you're
Yeah.
driving or you're walking. So we were both putting away, stacking chairs at a meeting. And so we were just chit chatting. And it came up that he thought of standardized tests, the New York State mandated standardized tests, kind of like a drug. And what he said was, we need drugs. They have a place, they have a purpose, but there comes a point when there's simply too many. And this was long enough ago that it was before the epidemic had really caught the public attention. We knew what was happening when cold turkey, quote unquote, seemed like a reasonable strategy.
Mm.
And it kind of made sense. But now we know so much more about drug addiction. We know so much more about standardized tests. And so the approach that we kind of took in the piece and in our conversations together is the idea of harm reduction, to learn lessons from those who've experienced the opium epidemics, who've had those experiences when a system is saturated with something. How do you mitigate harm? So harm reduction is kind of the door we're going to propose walking through.
Okay. And so just to sort of summarize kind of where we are right now, that some of this came from even the conversation that I had with Kelly Cartwright and Jen Saravallo maybe 6 to 8 months ago about reading instruction. And one of the places that we landed in that conversation was standardized testing is really kind of ruining reading instruction. And I hear that conversation end that way a lot, where people will be talking about a problem in education and they will travel down a path, and then at the end it'll say, if only it weren't for standardized testing, we would be able to fix fill in the blank problem, and everyone nods and agrees, and then we move on. And then nothing changes. And so this conversation, I think, and we have kind of agreed on this, that this conversation happens all the time. It happens in online spaces, in in-person spaces, and everyone just sort of wrings their hands and says, what are you going to do? And so our goal here is to use these principles of harm reduction that have come actually from the drug addiction community, and try to apply them to standardized testing, that instead of saying, oh, we should just get rid of them all, but we can't. So what are you going to do? We're trying to basically apply a more surgical approach to what can we do to actually mitigate the harm that they cause, because we have sort of accepted we can't get rid of them. So what you have proposed in this post that people are going to be able to get to and read in its full, we're going to just kind of summarize it. Um, you have taken some of the principles um, from, and I'll go ahead and just say that from the NHRC, the National Harm Reduction, National Center for Harm Reduction. They've got these principles, and so you're going to be pulling 5 moves that you think that we can make as educators, some small, some big, to address this testing problem, and maybe try to make it better for all of us.
Yeah. It,
So,
it feels so awkward to, on one hand, you can see it feels awkward to say, well, what do they have in common? You know, we're
mm,
talking drug addiction, we're talking standardized tests. Is the implication that we're addicted to tests? Well, no. The implication is that people have gone through an experience and they've learned lessons on how to reduce harm.
mhm,
And should if we know we cannot get rid of all the standardized tests immediately, like you said, the conversation ends there, but then where do we go from there? We can't do that. It's simply not. I think a lot about system change and levers of control. No one person, no even system has the levers of control that can turn off state testing or standardized
mhm,
testing. It's too tightly embedded in the system at this point. And so to continually say we just need to get rid of the tests and stop there, it doesn't reduce harm. We continue to do harm because we can't get
yes,
rid of those tests. And I think one of the things that really spoke to me with the NCHR principles is number one is acceptance. And to borrow directly from their first principle, the NHRC accepts, for better or for worse, that licit and illicit drug use is part of our world and chooses to work to minimize its harmful effects rather than simply ignore or condemn them. And I
right.
think that's such a powerful invitation for acceptance.
Yes. And so that is the first of your 5 moves that you're sort of recommending we consider, is that the problem being that these tests are not going away, and so your move that you're recommending is accept it. Just start by accepting that these are not going away. So I think that's, I mean, it's a pretty simple stance. I don't know that we have that much more to say about that first move, because it's just, I think a lot of us stand on one side or the other of either resisting it or, and so if we just don't resist it anymore, then we can move to a problem solving stance from that
Yeah.
point.
And I think that's such an important, Jen, because we're when we accept it, we say, okay, they're here. We can rant, we can rave, we can acknowledge all of the bad side effects of them. But if we first acknowledge they're here and then okay, accept it. Now let's talk about what we can do about it. And I think part of the next piece is they are very precise in their language. They talk about licit and illicit drugs. One of the challenges is that the phrase standardized tests is used in this very amorphous sort of way. So one of the things I want to
Mhm.
advocate for is kind of a second move is to be precise in our language, both as an advocate and as a recipient of advocacy. To call back to the conversation you had about reading instruction, it's a lot of conversation are happening about the state tests, and a lot of advocates are pointing to state test scores and saying, here's evidence that our students can't read. The
Mhm.
challenge is that, as far as I'm aware, there's only 2 states that actually have just reading assessments. And even their reading assessments aren't really reading, they're multiple choice questions. There's a
Mhm.
fantastic book that we recommend in the post called The Test. Anya Kamenetz, I'm pretty sure. My apologies to Anya if I mispronounced her last or her first name. And she talks about how about a child who is such a great reader. It took her; she never finished the state assessment because she overthought every single multiple choice question.
Mm.
So she appeared on the state test to not be a good reader, but because she wanted to argue every single multiple choice question. And so the the call to be more precise in our language is an invitation. If you're angry about the state assessments, name them as the federally mandated state assessments. If you're angry about a district created assessment, name that district created assessment. If you're angry about the dibbles or the ames web or the specific assessment that's frustrating you, name it. Rather than using the large category standardized tests, be specific. Name the thing that is causing you frustration, because we can't solve the problem. We can't address the problem if we're not specific about what's causing the problem. Likewise, if you hear someone saying, well, standardized tests show, insist on specificity, insist on a
Mm-hmm.
source, go and look at the test blueprint. A large part of state assessments, they're ELA tests, they're English language arts tests, which means there's a huge writing component.
Mm-hmm.
So if an advocate says, well, test scores say this, and a huge part of the test is writing, what is the problem you want us to solve? Is it reading? Is it writing? Kind of thinking about that particular component. So move two is, let's be more specific. When we're
Mm-hmm.
ranting and we're raging, let's be specific about our rants and rages.
Yes, because and that really does, it gets us much, much closer to solving whatever problem it is we are talking about. Because without that, it's just, again, it turns into this big blob, and then we just throw up our hands and move on, and nothing changes. One of the things that you bring up in the post, which I think is really interesting, was this statistic that, when we talk about all the tests that students take over the course of their school careers, which can vary from state to state, actually not a ton of them are federally mandated tests. A whole bunch of them are more at the state and district level, which means, and you point this out in the post, that our ability to change them becomes more doable if we're
Mm,
looking more and more locally. And so, from state to state and district to district, the people who are complaining about standardized testing may have more agency than they realize, because it could be these are locally mandated things that could be altered in some way.
yeah, absolutely. And even when it comes to those federally mandated tests, states are always looking for teachers to be a part of decision-making processes for the
Mhm.
state interpretation of those tests. So when you
Mhm.
talk about agency, if you're feeling incredibly frustrated with your state assessments, look into, go to your state ed website and look on their testing page, and you'll see, I'm confident in all 50 or plus the territories and DoD, there's a call for teacher assistance, whether it be field testing or finalized
Mm.
review. There's going to be a place where you can be involved in systems level change as a classroom teacher.
Okay, that's good to know. And I would bet a lot of teachers have that's flown over their heads in terms of just because of lack of time and whatnot, to know that, if I decide I want to really do something about it, maybe a team of teachers and I can carve out a little bit of time to figure out where are those pathways.
Mhm.
So, another issue, and this is probably one of the bigger ones, really, is that these tests consume so much time. And that time looks like the time actually set aside for taking them. I remember when I was a classroom teacher, if we had the state testing, there was just not going to be any instruction the entire week that we were giving the test, but also in all of the prep. So, what is this? We've got move number 3 now that you're recommending in terms of the time and energy that these tests take up.
So when I was doing curriculum and assessment design, we would advocate for authentic assessment, portfolio design, student-led conferences, giving students an opportunity to do things for authentic audiences. And when the pushback would come, well, we'd love to do this, but state tests, we had to come
Mhm.
up with a solution to say, we understand that, let me offer you some research. And so I created some work around what's called learner-centered test prep. And the idea of learner centered test prep is to repurpose the tests, both the taking of and the preparation of, to think about metacognitive skills. And so
Mm,
we share some resources related to giving kids time to do action research or about what kind of test taker they are, how
mm,
they mitigate their own nerves. So use the state tests, the time set aside for test prep, to get students time, give students time to think about who they are as a thinker, as a learner, as a test taker, because not all students manifest test anxiety the same way. Many don't even have test anxiety, but it's
mm.
helpful to think through what that looks like. And so we offer a couple different resources about that. And one of the things we know by this point, test prep workbooks, there's really no reason to think they're going to be helpful.
Mm.
Really, there is some pretty compelling evidence that what kids need is a specific instruction in the concept known as test wiseness. And that is the act of how to take a standardized test. In the same way our parents prep us for the road test.
Mhm.
People joke about you live in the middle of nowhere, but you got to do parallel parking. You'll never parallel park where you live, but you got to do your parallel parking. It's
Yeah.
the same sort of idea. You never drive with your hands at 10 and 2 unless, the adult's in the car, but you're going
Right.
to drive with your hands at 10 at 2. And there is a lot of compelling evidence. It's never settled, but I've read some pretty compelling studies that we link to in the resources that 7 to 10 days is the magic window. Think about test prep right before the test. It's not cramming. You're not trying to cram, 3 or 4 more ELA strategies into kids' brains. It's okay. We've been working on English language arts. Now it's time to start talking about taking everything we learned and transferring it to this particular forum, the state test, and then
Mhm.
focusing on how to take a state test.
So these schools that are, panicking about their test scores and therefore saying, look, all year long, we're just going to continue to just drill and drill and drill. They're wasting their time.
There is an argument to be made. They are. There's also an argument they're going to say, no, it's been worth it because look at our state test scores. But then we can say, okay, what are you gaining and what are you losing when you chase after test scores?
Mm.
Social scientists describe it as the idea of the Goodwin's law. Once you start chasing a measure, the measure ceases to be effective. So yes,
Mm.
you can do a lot of test prep year round. Your scores may go up, but to what end? What have you
And you
gained?
never really, yeah, and you'll never know if you had spent most of that time doing more project-based learning, more authentic assessment, yada yada yada, more just actual reading of books as opposed to passages and multiple choice questions,
Yeah, absolutely.
and just maybe spent a week before the test comes up to familiarize kids with the format of the test, and here's a couple things that you're going to need to be aware of. You may have ended up with the same results.
Yeah, exactly. And it
Yeah.
is worth stressing. We don't get into this in the article, but it is worth stressing because in New York State is so quirky. We have the thing called the Regents exams. And
Mhm.
young people are expected to pass 5 Regents exams over the course of their high school career in order to get a New York State high school diploma. And there's been a lot of shifts and a lot of changes. Actually, funny enough, next week is Regents Week. So
Mm.
schools are closed, but young people are still holding study sessions. Teachers are still doing test prep sessions before the Regents exams because Regents exams are next week. But we get a lot of research from the Regents exams. And one of the things that we know is that if the Regents week in June is too hot, student scores drop. If
Mm.
when that week isn't as hot, student scores are, on the average across the state higher. So we know other factors influence how students do on tests besides just test prep. So you can do 39 weeks of test prep and then have them take the test, and if the temperature's too hot, their scores are going to be lower regardless of what you did.
Wow.
So we can't ever act as if a large scale test is somehow like a thermometer. It's not. It's not a neutral measure. It's not void of other input. It's not in a vacuum. There's all these. I mean, kids are taking the test.
Yeah. Right.
You're going to have students who get look at their answer key and they have A, B, C. Well, the next one must be D because it makes a pattern. Kids do all sorts of crazy and interesting
Yeah.
things when they're taking tests.
Yeah. Yeah. So really for a school or a teacher that's feeling anxiety around why are we spending so much time all year round to do test prep, it's, they could just as easily be spending it doing higher quality instruction. And, I mean, I guess it's a hard gamble
Yeah.
for schools to take, and so maybe it's one of those things that you just gradually start to reduce the year-round stuff and just, see how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is a gamble, and it is one of those kinds of things. If you are a school leader who's looking for permission, please allow Jen and I to give you permission to stop doing so much test prep. I'm always happy to have conversations and share more resources. If someone is curious about the negative consequences of minimizing, workbooks, of getting rid of workbooks, of getting rid of all of that stuff. But
Yeah.
there is a compelling argument to be made that that's not necessarily benefiting anybody.
You say something else here in the post that I think is an important point for us to add here is you talk about the language, the tone, the vocabulary that we use when we talk about the tests with our students, and how that can also be a shift that we make in terms of the idea that the tests are, they just take over the whole culture of the school. How can we shift the way we even talk about them?
Yeah, and I don't know, pre 2020, I don't know, if schools went back to it, in 21, 22. But we used to do things like test prep rallies,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
things like that. I don't know if 2020 interrupted that pattern and schools kind of dropped them and didn't go back. That's my hope. But
Mm.
things like, celebrating students who get threes on the state tests, or otherwise, and a really kind of stressful one is that a 3 on a state test in, 7th grade could be the difference between honors 8th grade math and non-honors 8th grade math. So,
Mm.
using state test scores to gatekeep, which
Mhm.
most traditionally negatively impacts marginalized students with disabilities, students of color in the community. So we have to kind of think about, all of the ways in which state test scores have impacted the entire system, and start calling back some of those. Start thinking about using different measures,
Right.
for course admission. Get rid of those test prep rallies if you're still doing them. They're kind of
Ugh.
hard to justify, morally speaking.
They, yes, and well, and they also gobble up even more instructional time, and I was in schools that did that, and, you know, oh, and the assemblies with the kids who get the
Yeah.
certain scores. I mean, it's just all of that not only gobbles up tons and tons of time, but it does set a tone that makes these tests way more important than, if we want to shift away from the importance of them, that's one way to do it.
Yeah, for sure.
So we've got, I'm going to just to review for people listening. We've got our first three moves that we have talked about. One is just accept that they're not going away. Two is use much more precise, specific language when we talk about them so that we can figure out where we need to fine tune. The third move is to look at how we're spending our time and energy, school, year round at the classroom level, and see how we can start to redirect that time and energy toward things that are not focused on this big test and how important it is. So then we've got two more moves that get bigger. We start with the smaller moves that individuals can make, then we start to get to bigger moves. So your fourth big move is to redirect the time and energy more at the district level. And what would that look like?
So I think at the district level, the biggest shift is in probably how the district leadership talks about state test scores. Even now with the reading conversation, if you're telling your teachers, we'll know our students are reading better because they do better on state tests, what you're doing is you're advocating for a feedback loop in which you're equating non-reading tests as the measure of quality teaching. And there's a
Mm.
whole lot of issues with that. So I think part of what school leadership can do is just be clear in the language, what purpose the state assessments serve. We didn't write about it in the article, but one thing I would advocate for is, if you are, a high performing, quote unquote, air quotes, school district, and the annual rankings of your school district come out, there is a local superintendent near us who, there's his school, one of his schools always ranks very high, and every year
Mm.
he says, this is a meaningless, stop calling me about it, these scores are not helpful
Mm.
for anybody. And what he, a couple years ago, what he explicitly said was, my teachers work just as hard as the teachers at the school on the bottom of this list. Our
Mm.
students, the students who attend the school at the bottom of this list are just as fantastic as the students in my school. This list helps nobody. So, as much as boards of
Wow.
education like to be on those lists, as much as I'm sure it's awesome as a superintendent to see that your school district is number one in this region, or,
Mm.
on this list, use your position of authority to push back against those lists and say, this isn't helping anybody. It may help property values, but we have to kind of ask that question about when, that's a slightly different cycle that we have to break. And in move 5, we can talk more about that. And we know that's a systemic issue, but at the district level, move 5, if you are a teacher in a position on a district level committee, like a CDEP or some sort of district planning committee,
Mm,
advocate for pushing against those lists if your school community appears on them.
yeah.
Send the message to the teachers across the region that you recognize the lists are capturing something that doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening in the classroom.
Phew. That's I love that because, so often we have conversations with and among privileged people, pushing people with privilege to say to do something to dismantle existing systems that marginalize certain communities. And yet we don't always necessarily have a specific ask. It's just this general like work to dismantle, the privilege you have. But that's such a good example that when you are publicly being exalted and you're benefiting from, this, that's such a great statement to make, that my teachers are not working any harder than the teachers in the schools that have these lower scores, to be able to come out and publicly say that,
Yeah.
or to turn down an opportunity to get attention for it, is such a great, example of how we can start to, I don't know, reduce the power of these
Yeah.
tests. Yeah.
Mitigate that harm.
Yes, yes.
And I think
Um,
what's interesting is that superintendent, without meaning to, was in a very, very small way mitigating harm against the children in the school at the bottom of that list.
exactly. And that person, a person in that position, is really one of the only people that can do it. The person at the bottom can't be like, "These test scores don't mean anything." Everyone's gonna go, "Yeah, sure, you would say that."
Yeah, you
But
can
for the
say that.
person,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
the person with the high test scores saying that, it carries a different kind of weight for sure. Um, there's also something in these principles. Let's talk a little bit too about how district level people can treat these scores when it comes to how they really do a lot of harm to people at different socioeconomic, racial, demographics, um, because they do. So how can we address testing at a district level in terms of how it impacts marginalized communities?
Yeah, and I think there is the thinking about gatekeeping. Are you using the state test scores to keep marginalized students out of particular things? Are you using test scores to punish at the classroom level? And I think that's
Mhm.
another important thing to keep in mind, is that state assessments are designed for state level data collection. They aren't designed to be a fine grain of sand of an individual student. That's why we need, for like with reading, things like Dibbles and Ames Web are designed for an individual test taker. Large scale state tests, like state assessments, are designed for aggregate. So one of the things we can do for marginalized students is, if you keep seeing all of your marginalized students grouped together with state test scores, like you look at a list of students who get a particular place, someone made a list as a result of state test score data, and those are all of your children of color, that should be raising a whole lot of red flags that sit outside the state test scores, and kind of having those conversations about why that pattern is happening and why people choose to kind of make those sort of patterns. And I think part of it we also want to think about is locally created standardized assessments. Teachers are not psychometricians. A psychometrician is
Mm,
a person whose job is to design standardized assessments. And it takes a lot of work to design. One of the reasons state tests ask for teacher volunteers is it takes an incredible amount of human power to design large scale standardized tests with all the different stages and steps. It takes a lot of time. And
mm,
because of that, they're able to make certain claims about reliability and validity. But at the classroom level, or the district level or the school level, teachers don't necessarily have that level of training around reliability and validity and measurement error. So
mhm.
at the district level, we can be sure to make sure we're minimizing bias. And there are some tools and strategies. We share some in the article. And the students who are most negatively impacted by those biases and assessments are marginalized students.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be small things as, I have a whole collection of examples of bias built into tests. At one end, there is the multiple choice math question that made it to the news, where a district built a question around slavery and how many bales of hay could an enslaved person bale in one day. Really culturally insensitive, really wildly inappropriate test questions, to
Mm.
smaller ones. There's some
Mm-hmm.
interesting research around stereotype threat,
Mm-hmm.
related to girls in math and sciences. And so there is a lot of compelling research out there about minimizing bias in locally created assessments that districts could spend some time thinking through and thinking about.
And so, with that in mind, also, yeah, in terms of how do we then use our tests to make all kinds of decisions about opportunities that our students have and so on. And so, and again, it's another important thing for us to be keeping in mind when we talk about the problem of testing is
Mm,
we are all having our own human responses to the scores in terms of the decisions we make at the district level. So that's another thing we can do to mitigate the harm is
mm,
not move forward on certain things based on test scores, knowing that they're flawed.
mhm,
So the fifth and final big move is to redirect the time and energy we spend on standardized tests at the state level. And so, again, teachers listening may not actually have any control of this, but you're about to give us some pretty good examples of states that are doing this. And so, a lot of times, I think there are some states out there that just don't know what the options are. And when they see another state doing something, then it's, oh, okay, maybe we can do it like they're doing. So, talk to us about what's happening in some other places that might be helpful.
For sure. To go back to the analogy about harm reduction as it relates to
Mhm.
licit and illicit drugs, there's a fairly powerful miniseries called Dope Sick. And at the end of Dope Sick, one of the things that comes out is that one of the doctors who prescribed later became addicted to the substance he was prescribing,
Mm.
later developed a intervention strategy for people who were addicted and were looking to move away from a harmful use of these illicit drugs. And one of the show ends with this incredibly hopeful note. So move 5, even though this isn't something teachers can do, I hope it offers them some hope. There are people working incredibly hard at a systems level. There are people coming up with treatment solutions that are very slowly but very methodically working their way down into the system. A piece just came out today in the New York Times where the author talks up with Texas and I believe Tennessee, I think, about approaches they're using. And so one approach is instead of having one big week of testing, break it up into smaller components over the course of the year so that the tests really look no different to young people than a chapter test or a
Mm.
regular sort of, okay, we're just doing a unit test. It
Mhm.
no longer has the, high
Yep.
anxiety of the state tests. It's just this, kind of run of the mill sort of unit test. Another option, another kind of hopeful glimmer that's coming out of is out of the state of Massachusetts. And they're really doing some really kind of big, audacious reconceptualization of the entire concept of how we test. And in the article, I cite two scholars, Ethan Hunt and Jack Snyder, who wrote a great book that just came out about grades and testing. And Jack's work around beyond test scores is acknowledging that they're here, but how can we go beyond them? And how can we use the state test scores in a way that don't harm at all and
Mm.
more useful information? So there's breaking up the state test into smaller tests. There's Massachusetts work around performance-based assessments. New York State has its own performance consortium. There is my personal wish, my personal hope, that I think I had this idea like 10 years ago and I think it's swell. I think I would hope, I haven't heard any of one making the shift, but instead of having ELA tests, we switch to a model where we do science and social studies content. Stop giving
Mm.
kids multiple choice tests about poetry. Just take the
Mm.
poetry out of the test. Let's do science and social studies content so young people are reading informational text and answering questions based on informational text, if
Yeah,
that's what we want to get a measure of.
right.
So, kind of thinking about reconceptualizing the ELA test. Math people are always working on different ways to think about the math assessments. I know some states are experimenting with more explanation of student thinking. So it's less about basic arithmetic and more
Mm.
about how students are
Mm-hmm.
thinking about math. So move 5, I hope a classroom teacher read it and feels like it is possible. Things are changing. It feels incredibly slow, and it's not fast enough, which is why we put this as step 5, because 1 through 4 are about mitigating the harm
Right.
until we resolve the pandemic or the epidemic or the infestation, whatever word we want to use there to describe state
Yes.
testing.
Yes. Can you give me a little bit more on what's going on in Massachusetts? You're saying they're like really trying to reconceptualize what it looks like. Just like what are they doing?
So the first thing that they're doing is Massachusetts and New York. In education, American education history, Massachusetts and New York have always kind of gone back and forth. Like technically Massachusetts had the first Department of Education, but New York technically had the first board overseeing educate, like the first system. So New York and Massachusetts are always back and forth. So Massachusetts has its own version of the Regents exams,
Mhm.
high school exit exams, and they're about to vote. I believe it's working its way through the state house that they're going to eliminate that. So they're going to change state law so that students no
Okay.
longer need to pass a standardized test to graduate high school. The other thing that they're doing, and it's hard to do it justice because it is such a systemic effort. So what they're looking at is portfolio and performance-based assessment that are embedded throughout the year. So it's not a unit test throughout the year necessarily. It's more of a writing piece. It's more of a math problem-solving piece. It's
Mm.
dismantling it's kind of dismantling the state assessment structure as some big overhead scary sort of thing and bringing it down to the classroom level, making it much
Mhm.
more useful for teachers, making it much more informative for school districts. So it's kind of breaking the paradigm of what a standardized test is and making it more useful to schools. So I was anyone
Okay.
interested in the Massachusetts work. I provided a bunch of links to the different projects, and
Okay.
I recommend checking it out. Jack's book is called Beyond Test Scores, where he
Mhm.
lays out kind of the approach that his assessment center is using to kind of tackle the big issues.
Awesome. So you and I have touched on, I'd say maybe about 60 to 70% of what's actually in the post. So I would strongly recommend that people go over and really read it because it's tons and tons of hyperlinks out to other resources because this is a big, gnarly problem. And so it's got a lot of outgoing pathways. For people who want to follow up a little bit more with you personally, where's the best place to find you online?
So on the site of which we no longer speak, my social media handle is Jenn Binis, Jen with 2 N's, Binis. And my editing service is Schoolmarm Advisors. So you can find me on Schoolmarm Advisors. And as you can see by the name, I spend a lot of time writing and thinking and talking about education history. And I think one thing that's kind of helpful for people to keep in mind is that you may listen to all this and say, well, why does anyone still like standardized testing? One
Mm,
thing that's worth thinking about is historically, even recent history, there is a progressive argument to be made for standardized testing. One of my favorite sort of anecdotes from education history is that in Washington, D.C., in the turn of the century, Black schools were funded at the same rate as white schools. And there was a Black school in Washington, D.C., where all of the teachers were some of the preeminent thinkers in physics, in literature. I mean, just really phenomenal people who were not able, due to systemic racism, to get jobs in their field. And so they would come to
mm,
this school and work for a bit. And every year they could demonstrate that they performed just as well as, if not better, than white students. And so it was used as an argument as to why, Black students were entitled as children to receive education on par with white students. And so there have
mm,
been historically, the NAACP argued incredibly vocally for standardized testing as a way to identify gaps. So on
mhm,
one hand, we can say, how can anyone possibly defend this? There is a lot, I mean, in the 1830s in Boston, they use standardized testing as a way to justify the mere existence of public education. Look, this works. We can teach kids and we can show it through these tests. So I'm a big fan of looking back in history to kind of see perhaps where some of our things came from. So if people are feeling as if, well, how can you justify standardized testing? How can someone do that? I'm happy to provide resources to continue that conversation. So yeah, School Mom Advisors is where you can find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming on here and tackling this issue. And hopefully we have added some more nuance to this conversation, but most of us are just throwing our hands up all the time. I really appreciate it.
Bring those hands down and we can do this. We can troubleshoot this. We can mitigate the harm.
To read Jenn's blog post, which is full of links to outside resources that go even deeper on specific topics around standardized testing, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 220. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening and have a great day.